risks. In the previous video, we talked about the benefits. In this video, we're going to talk about the risks. And the main risks are divided across these 6 categories. And we're going to have a separate slide for each of these categories, starting with the first one, which is greater potential for speculative use. And I ended the last video talking about this risk that derivatives, because of the small amount of money required to create much larger positions, and this is through leverage, what happens is that this magnifies the profit and losses and increases the likelihood of financial distress. And this is something which is substantiated with a lot of research, and it can become very, very bad if it is kind of having a dominoes effect, that one big financial institution falls down and then they owe money to another financial institution, and then because of that other financial institution falls down, and it could cause some very, very systemic problems, and we will talk about that as well, that the whole system can come down. So this is one of the main issues with derivatives. So where we have discussed the benefits, that you can use very less or zero cash to create large exposures, where that is a benefit, that is also a risk if not used properly. Secondly, a lot of derivatives are done over the counter. So as you might know, the difference between forwards and futures. Futures are obviously exchange traded, so they're centralized, documented, but forwards are over the counter and they're customized and private. So if that is the situation, then that means that there is a lot of lack of transparency, because they're private and nobody really knows what's going on, and then they're so complicated at times, especially when we're talking about embedded derivatives, that there is a security, and then within that security something is attached to it, as for example a convertible bond or with a CDS option. So it gets more and more complicated, and with the starting with the less transparency as it becomes very, very difficult to understand by regulators and central banks. Now, what is basis risk? So let me give you an example over here. Let's say there is an airline and this airline is issuing tickets for next year's season. Already people are buying in advance, and in return they're getting money for those tickets. Now, naturally, they've done some pricing, right? How they've come up with the price for these tickets, they've done some pricing, and this price assumes a certain oil price, because that is the main cost of this airline, because I mean the plane runs on oil, right? So what the airline does is they are worried that the oil price might go up, and since they have already locked the pricing and sold the tickets, so in order to make sure that they don't lose if the oil price goes up by the time the next season comes, what they do is they get into a future contract to buy oil, right? Now let's say when the time comes, the oil price does go up, and it was $50 when they were selling the tickets, and by the time they are actually flying the plane, it is $60, and they're having to buy oil at 60. So they lose approximately $10 per barrel over here, because they're having to buy expensive oil, but they will gain over here on their futures contract, because they got into the futures contract when the oil price was 50, and by that time when they're actually having to purchase the oil price is 60. So they will gain over here and they will lose over here. But sometimes what happens is that the gain in this contract and the loss in this contract is not exactly the same, right? There is some little bit difference because obviously this is a different contract. It has different costs. It has different. It's a completely different transaction, right? And this is a completely different transaction. So it should be somewhat similar, but there will be a little bit risk. There will be a little bit difference, and that is what we call basis risk. So derivatives are often used to hedge the risk of a commercial or financial exposure, which is what is being done in this example. They are hedging their risk. The assumption is that the derivative instrument will be highly effective in offsetting the price risk of the underlying, and it is effective. The underlying asset is going up in price and the derivative is offsetting. It is highly effective, but in some cases what happens, the expected value differs from the unexpectedly from the underlying, and this is referred to as the basis risk. So let's say, for example, in the futures market, it does not go up to 60 exactly, it goes to maybe, let's say, 59, right? Whereas the spot market has gone up to 60 or something like this. So if there is a little bit difference between the two, this is what is known as basis risk, when it does not exactly match the underlying exposure. Next, let's talk about liquidity risk, and I'll give you the same example again, that you have the airline and it's doing your tickets, right? And in parallel, it's gotten into a futures contract. Now, the problem with the futures contract is that unlike a forward contract, you have to have a margin. You have to have a margin deposited over here. And let's say it sold the tickets based on a $50 price, that it currently the oil price is 50, and it did its pricing, and based on that pricing it sold the tickets and it got the money, and it was worried that oil price might go up. So what they did was they also bought oil in the futures market at $50 a barrel. Now the other situation has happened. Oil price has actually come down. Oil price has come down. Let's say it has come down to $40. It has come down to $40. Now there will be a gain over here by the time that the next season arrives and they have to buy oil, and they will buy at a lower price. So that's good. They will definitely have a gain over here next year. But this loss will be there in the futures contract, and this loss is going to hit their margin, which means whatever little deposit they had posted over here will get zero, will become zero, and they will have to immediately deposit more money over here, which is called a mark to market, right? They're going to have to immediately deposit money, and it's not necessary that they have the extra cash lying around, right? Because this benefit, this gain, they're going to get next year or next season, whenever they actually have to go and buy the oil at the cheaper price. Right now this loss is going to be there, and they're going to have to come up with the cash from somewhere and deposit, otherwise this futures contract is going to close forcibly. So liquidity risk refers to the divergence in cash flow timing in terms of the derivative versus the underlying transaction, because this whole underlying transaction is going to be next season, but this loss is right now, right? So there is a difference in the timing, and the futures requires daily settlement of gains and losses, and this can give rise to liquidity risk. As an investor using futures to hedge an underlying transaction may be unable to meet a margin call, right? And maybe the airline doesn't have that much cash lying around due to lack of funds, and may be forced to close the position. And maybe they are forced to close it because they don't have cash, and by the time the next season comes, let's say oil price goes up to 60. So now they're not going to have a gain, they're actually going to have a loss, because they'll have to buy expensive oil, and this transaction won't help them because they would have already closed this by the time the next season actually comes, because they were unable to deposit the loss when it was down. Another risk is the counterparty credit risk. And let's say we are investing in shares of Tesla, and we're not actually buying the shares, what we are doing is we are getting call options. And the current price is, let's say, $900 per share, and we think that this can become $2,000, right? So what we do is we get call options for Tesla shares at 10,000, and we only pay a small premium, let's say $100. This is the premium that we pay, and this premium could go to waste if the price doesn't go above 1,000, right? But if it does go above 1,000, then we have the right to buy at 1,000. Currently the price is at 900, and let's say 1 year later the price does actually go to $2,000 per share. Now whoever sold this, there is a financial institution that has sold this call option to us. And now we go to this financial institution and we ask them to sell us each share of Tesla for 1,000, because they sold us the right to buy it at 1,000, and now they have the obligation to sell, but they are not selling it to us for 1,000, and they have declared bankruptcy and they have closed their office. So this is something which is known as counterparty credit risk. So derivatives can result in significant counterparty credit exposure, and this could be infinite. So for example, it doesn't go to 2,000, let's say it goes to 3,000 or 4,000 or 5,000. I mean, anything can happen, right? So there is no limit to the amount of risk we have on this financial institution. So with respect to a bond, the risk is limited, because what is the maximum you can lose? You can lose the entire investment and the interest. So you can lose the principal and the interest, right? But with derivatives, for example, a call option seller has no counterparty risk after receiving the premium. So they have no risk because they have received the premium from us. They have received the premium from us, they have no risk, but we have the risk. But the call option buyer is exposed to the counterparty credit risk, which varies depending on the price of the underlying. So if the price of the underlying is going up, our risk is going up. And now I'm going to tie this into the whole system, that starting with the use of leverage and all this counterparty risk. If you think about it, let's say there are a lot of big banks and they are giving each other exposure through derivatives with very little cash taken from each other and having huge counterparty risk on each other. And if one of them goes down, then it just creates a sort of domino effect, right? And this has been seen in the past. So derivatives are often blamed to have destabilizing consequences on financial markets, primarily due to the high amount of leverage taken by speculators, because if the position turns against them, then they default. And this creates a domino effect or a ripple effect, causing their creditors to default, and then the creditors of their creditors to default, and so on, right? And this is what we saw in 2008, that one of the big banks went down, and then the other one went down, and the Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers. And then eventually the government had to step in and sort of say, okay, we're going to stop this, we're going to bail Bank of America out so that this whole situation stops. Otherwise, if Bank of America had gone down, then everybody who Bank of America owed money to would have gone down. And now how we have kind of fixed this situation, and primarily the main derivative that was to blame was swaps, especially the ones which were being done over the counter. So we didn't even know, there was so much lack of transparency that how much was the size of the transaction. So now that has partially been taken care of through something called a central clearing mandate and a central clearing counterparty, which basically is something we've discussed in a previous video. And what this means is that the counterparty risk is actually taken out, and the central counterparty is created so that we know that how much counterparty risk is there in order to reduce the systemic risk. So let's now talk about the summary of risks. In the previous video, we did a summary for the benefits. We'll do a summary for the risks here. And then in the last video for this learning module, we're going to compare the use of derivatives by issuers and investors. So let's do the summary here, and then we will move on to the next video after that. So greater use greater potential for speculative use, and that is because of the leverage, right? You need very little cash, so you can use very little cash or almost zero cash sometimes, even if you're a big financial institution, to create very, very large positions. And especially if they're over the counter, they're private, so there's a lack of transparency, nobody really knows what's going on, they're very, very complex. There could be basis risk, so think about the future contract of oil price the airline did, and the actual amount the airline had to pay for oil, and the difference between the two. If there is a little bit difference in price of the futures contract and the actual spot price of oil, then there will be a little difference in the gain from the futures contract and the loss in the actual transaction. The liquidity risk could be there when, for example, the oil price was going down and they were having to post margin, and let's say they didn't have the cash and they were not able to maintain the position and the position got closed, and by the time the next season came, the oil price went up and they had to buy expensive oil, and their futures position was already closed because they didn't have the liquidity to maintain that position. Counterparty risk is basically not there very much if you are a receiver of the premium, but it is there if you are a seller of the premium, for the other party if you're a buyer of the premium, and if the price of the underlying is going up, then you can have as even infinite amount of counterparty risk. And if you combine all of this together, that greater use of speculation and lack of transparency and all this basis risk and liquidity risk, and especially the counterparty risk, it leads to a very, very large uh, system wide risk, which could lead to destabilization and systemic risk. And this is something we have seen in the past. Excessive risk taking and use of leverage in derivatives markets may contribute to market stress, as in the 2008 financial crisis. So, that is the end of our discussion on derivative risks. In the next video, which will be the last video of this learning module, we're going to compare the use of derivatives by issuers and investors. So, see you in the next video.